On a warm spring morning in 1998, in the quiet rural stretches of Arkansas, a woman vanished without a trace. Her name was Jennifer Thompson, 32 years old, mother of 2 young children, wife to a man who would tell authorities she simply walked away from everything she knew. The farmhouse where she lived sat isolated among acres of cotton fields, the nearest neighbor more than half a mile down a gravel road that kicked up dust whenever a vehicle passed. When deputies arrived 3 days after her husband reported her missing, they found her car in the driveway, her purse on the kitchen counter, her coffee mug still sitting beside the sink, with a brown ring dried at the bottom. Everything suggested she had been there one moment and gone the next, as if she had evaporated into the thick Arkansas air. But in cases like these, people do not simply vanish. Someone always knows what happened. The question that would haunt investigators for nearly 2 decades was simple and terrible. Who was lying, and what were they hiding? Craighead County in northeastern Arkansas is farming country, where the land stretches flat and endless beneath enormous skies. In 1998, the Thompson property sat 7 miles outside the small town of Jonesboro, a community of about 50,000 people where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. The house itself was a modest, single-story structure with white aluminum siding that had yellowed over time, a front porch with a rusted metal glider, and a carport that listed slightly to one side. Behind the house, fields of cotton stretched toward a tree line in the distance, and in the spring, when the plants were still low, you could see clear across to where the Thompsons' nearest neighbors lived. Jennifer Thompson had grown up in Jonesboro, the daughter of a postal worker and a woman who cleaned houses. She had married David Thompson when she was 23, and he was 25, both of them young and convinced they knew what they wanted from life. David worked as a mechanic at a John Deere dealership in town, his hands perpetually stained with grease, his knuckles scarred from years of skinned contact with engine parts and stubborn bolts. Jennifer had worked part-time at a daycare center until their second child was born, after which she stayed home full-time. Their daughter, Emma, was 7 years old in the spring of 1998. Their son, Michael, was 4. Those who knew the family said Jennifer was devoted to her children, the kind of mother who packed elaborate lunches and volunteered for every school event, who kept a calendar on the refrigerator marked with appointments and activities in different colored pens. The morning of May 14, 1998, began like any other. The sun rose just after 6, burning off the morning mist that hung low over the fields. Jennifer woke early, as she always did, and made coffee in the percolator that sat on the counter beside the stove. She got the children dressed and fed them breakfast at the small kitchen table, scrambled eggs and toast, a routine so ordinary it left no impression on anyone who might have seen it. David left for work at 7:15, his truck disappearing down the gravel drive in a cloud of dust. Emma caught the school bus at the end of the road at 7:45, her small figure visible from the house as she waited with her backpack, a pink thing with cartoon characters on it. Jennifer stood on the porch and waved as the bus pulled away, the same gesture she made every weekday morning. After Emma left, Jennifer returned inside with Michael. The television was on in the living room, playing a children's program with bright colors and exaggerated voices. The house was quiet except for that noise, and the occasional sound of Michael playing with his toy trucks on the braided rug in the center of the room. The morning passed slowly, as mornings do when you are home with a young child, marked by small routines and repetitive tasks. Laundry needed folding, dishes needed washing, the kitchen floor needed sweeping. At some point, Jennifer made herself a second cup of coffee and stood at the window looking out at the fields. And then, according to David Thompson, she was gone. When David arrived home from work that evening at 5:30, he said he found Michael alone in the house. The boy was sitting on the floor in front of the television, which was still on, playing static now because the program had ended hours before. David said he called out for Jennifer, walking through the house room by room, opening closet doors and checking the bathroom. Her car was in the carport. Her purse was on the counter. Her coffee mug was beside the sink. He went outside and walked around the property, calling her name, his voice carrying across the empty fields. He checked the barn, a sagging structure behind the house where they kept some old farm equipment and bags of feed for the chickens they no longer owned. Nothing. He came back inside and asked Michael where his mother was. The boy, 4 years old and not entirely certain what was happening, said he did not know. He said she had been there, and then she had not. David waited. He told investigators later that he thought she might have gone for a walk, though she never went for walks. Not out here where there was nowhere to walk, except along the empty road or through the fields. He waited through the evening, and when Emma came home from a friend's house at 7, he still had not called anyone. He fed the children dinner, canned soup heated on the stove, and put them to bed. He stayed up late, sitting in the living room in the dark, waiting for headlights to appear at the end of the drive. They never did. The next morning, Friday, May 15th, Jennifer was still gone. David got the children ready and took Emma to school himself, Michael sitting in the truck's passenger seat beside him. He went to work, told his supervisor his wife was not feeling well, and left early. He came home to the empty house and waited again. That evening, he called Jennifer's mother, a woman named Patricia Wells who lived in Jonesboro. He told her Jennifer was missing, that she had not been home since Thursday morning, that he did not know where she was. Patricia asked why he had waited so long to call anyone. David said he thought she would come back. Patricia said she was calling the authorities immediately. The Craighead County Sheriff's Office received the missing person report late Friday evening. A deputy named Russell Hayes drove out to the Thompson property just after 9 at night, his headlights cutting through the darkness as he turned onto the gravel road. The house was lit from within, every light on as if trying to push back against something unseen. David met him at the door, his face drawn and tired, his work clothes still on. Deputy Hayes asked him to describe what had happened, and David told the story the same way he would tell it many times in the days ahead. He came home from work Thursday evening and found his wife gone, her car still there, her things still there, but Jennifer herself nowhere to be found. Hayes asked if they had argued. David said no, they had not argued, things were fine. Hayes asked if Jennifer had been upset about anything, if she had seemed troubled or distressed. David said no, she had been the same as always that morning, quiet and busy with the children. Hayes asked about friends Jennifer might have gone to visit, family she might be staying with. David said she would not leave the children, that she would never do that. Hayes wrote everything down in his notebook, his pen scratching across the page in the quiet of the living room. He asked to see Jennifer's belongings, and David showed him the purse on the counter, the coffee mug beside the sink, the car in the carport with the keys hanging on a hook by the door. Before Hayes left that night, he spoke to Michael, the 4-year-old boy who had been alone in the house when his father came home. The boy sat on the couch with a blanket pulled up to his chin, his eyes wide and uncertain. Hayes knelt down beside him and asked in a gentle voice where his mother had gone. Michael said he did not know. Hayes asked if his mother had said anything before she left, if she had told him she was going somewhere. Michael shook his head. Hayes asked if anyone else had come to the house that day, if Michael had seen anyone or heard anything unusual. The boy looked at his father, then back at Hayes and said nothing. The search for Jennifer Thompson began in earnest the following morning, Saturday, May 16th. Deputies arrived at the property at first light, their vehicles lined up along the gravel road. Volunteers from the community showed up as well. People who knew the family or knew someone who knew the family. People who wanted to help, because that is what you do in small towns when something terrible happens. They spread out across the fields, walking in lines with their eyes on the ground, searching for any sign that Jennifer had been there, that she had walked away from the house and gotten lost or hurt somewhere in the expanse of farmland. They searched the tree line at the far edge of the property, pushing through underbrush and calling her name into the silence. They searched the barn and the outbuildings, looking in places David said he had already looked. They found nothing. By late afternoon, more than 50 people were involved in the search. The local television station sent a crew to film the effort. And that evening, Jennifer's face appeared on the news. A photograph that showed her smiling at the camera, her hair pulled back, her eyes bright. The anchor described her as a loving mother of two, who had vanished without explanation from her home in rural Craighead County. They showed footage of the searchers walking through the fields, their figures small against the landscape. They interviewed Patricia Wells, Jennifer's mother, who stood in front of the cameras with her hands clasped together and begged anyone with information to come forward. She said her daughter would never leave her children, that something terrible must have happened, that someone must know something. The investigation expanded quickly. Detectives from the Craighead County Sheriff's Office began interviewing everyone who knew Jennifer, trying to piece together a picture of her life and determine if there was any reason she might have left voluntarily. They spoke to friends who said Jennifer had seemed happy, that she talked about her children constantly, and was planning Emma's birthday party for the following month. They spoke to family members who said the same, that Jennifer was devoted to her family, that she had no history of instability or impulsive behavior. They spoke to neighbors, though the Thompsons' nearest neighbors were far enough away that no one had seen or heard anything unusual on the day Jennifer disappeared. Clear's throat, and they spoke to David Thompson, again and again, going over his story in minute detail. David told them he had gone to work Thursday morning at 7:15, the same time he always left. He said he had been at the dealership all day, working on a combine that needed a new hydraulic line and diagnosing a problem with a tractor's transmission. He said he had taken his lunch break at noon, eating a sandwich in the break room with two other mechanics. He said he had left work at 5, stopped to get gas at a station on the edge of town, and arrived home at 5:30 to find Jennifer gone. The timeline seemed straightforward, and when detectives checked with his supervisor and coworkers, everyone confirmed David had been at work that day, that he had been there all day, that nothing had seemed unusual about his behavior or demeanor. But there were small things that did not fit. When deputies first arrived at the house Friday night, they noticed the kitchen was unusually clean, the counters wiped down, the floor swept, the dishes in the drainer all put away. David said Jennifer always kept the house clean, that this was normal. When they asked about the coffee mug beside the sink, David said Jennifer must have left it there Thursday morning after he went to work. But the coffee in the mug was old, the residue dried and crusted, and it sat alone beside a sink that was otherwise spotless, as if someone had cleaned everything except that one cup. There were other inconsistencies, small discrepancies in David's account that investigators noted but could not quite explain. He said he had arrived home at 5:30. But the gas station receipt they retrieved showed he had purchased fuel at 5:47, and the station was only 10 minutes from the house. Where had he been during those missing minutes? David said he must have been mistaken about the time, that he had not been paying close attention, that he had been worried about Jennifer and confused about when exactly he had arrived home. He said maybe he had sat in the truck for a few minutes before going inside, trying to think of where she might have gone. Investigators asked about the relationship between David and Jennifer, whether there had been problems in the marriage, arguments, tensions that might have escalated into something more serious. David said they had their disagreements like any couple, but nothing significant, nothing that would make Jennifer leave. Those who knew him said David was quiet, reserved, the kind of man who kept his thoughts to himself and did not show much emotion. At work, his coworkers described him as reliable but distant, someone who did his job well but did not socialize much or talk about his personal life. At home, neighbors who saw him in passing said he seemed like a normal husband and father, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing alarming. But there was something in the way David spoke about Jennifer's disappearance that troubled some of the investigators. He seemed calm, almost detached, as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else rather than his own wife. When Patricia Wells broke down crying during one of the early interviews, David sat beside her with his hands folded in his lap, his face expressionless. When reporters asked him to appeal directly to Jennifer or to whoever might have taken her, he spoke in a flat, measured tone, saying he hoped she would come home soon, that the children missed her. There was no tremor in his voice, no visible sign of distress. Deputy Hayes wrote in his notes, "Subject shows unusual composure given circumstances. Affect does not match severity of situation." Those who have ever doubted someone you love understand the particular kind of unease that comes with that doubt. It is not dramatic or sudden. It creeps in slowly, accumulating in small moments that individually mean nothing, but together form a pattern you cannot ignore. For the investigators working Jennifer Thompson's case, that doubt began to accumulate in the days following her disappearance. It was there in the way David's timeline did not quite add up, in the way his house was too clean, in the way he showed no emotion when he should have been frantic with worry. But doubt is not evidence, and without Jennifer's body, without any physical proof of foul play, there was nothing to charge David with, nothing to do except keep searching and hope that something would surface that would tell them what had really happened. The search continued through the weekend and into the following week. Divers checked the nearby ponds and waterways. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the property, their handlers walking them slowly across the fields and around the buildings, waiting for the dogs to alert on the scent of human remains. The dogs found nothing. Helicopters flew overhead with thermal imaging equipment, looking for any sign of a body hidden in the dense brush or buried in a shallow grave. They found nothing. As the days passed and no trace of Jennifer emerged, the media attention began to fade. The story moved from the front page to the inside sections, and eventually it disappeared from the news altogether. By June, the case had gone cold. Investigators had pursued every lead, interviewed everyone connected to Jennifer, searched every place she might have been. They had found no evidence of an abduction, no signs of a struggle, no indication that Jennifer had been taken from her home by force. They had also found no evidence that she had left voluntarily, no withdrawals from the bank account she shared with David, no activity on her credit cards, no sightings of her anywhere. She had simply ceased to exist on May 14, 1998, as if she had stepped out of the world and left nothing behind but questions. The swing hung still in the backyard, the chains holding it creaking slightly in the breeze. The toy truck lay on its side in the grass where Michael had left it. And inside the house, David Thompson went about his life, caring for his children, going to work, coming home to the empty rooms where his wife had once been. If he knew what had happened to Jennifer, he gave no sign. He answered investigators' questions when they called. He cooperated with every request. He passed a polygraph examination, though those who administered it noted his physiological responses were unusually flat, almost as if he had trained himself not to react. And then, as the months stretched into years, the investigation slowed to a halt. The file remained open, but there was nowhere left to look, no new leads to follow. Jennifer Thompson had vanished, and it seemed she would stay vanished. Part 2. The investigation the days immediately following Jennifer's disappearance saw Craighead County mobilize in a way it rarely had before. Search and rescue teams came from neighboring counties, their vans and trucks parked along the gravel roads that crisscrossed the rural landscape. The Arkansas State Police sent investigators to assist the sheriff's office, recognizing that a case of this nature required resources beyond what the county could provide alone. By Sunday, May 17th, more than 100 volunteers had joined the search effort, combing through fields and forests, checking abandoned buildings, and searching along the banks of every creek and drainage ditch within a 10-mile radius of the Thompson property. The command center was established in the parking lot of a Baptist church 3 miles from the Thompson home. Long tables were set up with maps of the area spread across them, marked with grids and color-coded zones to keep track of where teams had already searched. Coffee urns were brought in by church members, along with sandwiches and cookies for the volunteers who showed up in waves throughout the day. The atmosphere was somber but energized, everyone believing that if they just looked hard enough, if they covered enough ground, they would find Jennifer Thompson and bring her home. Deputy Hayes coordinated much of the ground search, assigning teams to specific areas and maintaining radio contact as they reported back. He had been with the sheriff's office for 12 years and had worked missing person cases before, but nothing quite like this. Usually, when someone went missing in rural Arkansas, there was some explanation that emerged fairly quickly. They had gone to visit relatives and forgotten to tell anyone. They had walked away from a difficult situation and needed time alone. They had been involved in an accident and were found injured but alive. But Jennifer Thompson's case had none of those easy answers. Every hour that passed without finding her made the likelihood of a positive outcome diminish. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Local businesses donated supplies. Radio stations broadcast regular updates and appeals for information. A reward fund was established, growing quickly as donations poured in from people who had never met Jennifer but felt compelled to help. Her photograph was printed on flyers that were posted throughout Jonesboro and the surrounding towns, stapled to telephone poles and taped in store windows. The image showed Jennifer smiling, her face open and kind, the kind of face that made people want to help, that made her disappearance feel personal even to strangers. Patricia Wells, Jennifer's mother, became the public face of the family's anguish. She gave interviews to every news outlet that requested one, standing in front of cameras with Jennifer's photograph clutched in her hands, begging for information. She described her daughter as a devoted mother who would never abandon her children, who loved them more than anything in the world. She said there had to be an explanation, that someone must have taken Jennifer, that her daughter would never have left on her own. When reporters asked about David, Patricia's expression would tighten, her lips pressing into a thin line. She said David was cooperating with the investigation, that he was taking care of the children, that everyone needed to focus on finding Jennifer. But privately, Patricia had begun to have doubts. She told investigators that something about David's behavior troubled her, though she could not articulate exactly what it was. She said he had always been quiet, even when he and Jennifer were dating, but there was a difference between being quiet and being emotionless. She said when she had spoken to him on the phone Friday night, before she called the authorities, he had sounded strange, distant, as if he were reading from a script. She said he had waited too long to report Jennifer missing, and she could not understand why. If it had been her husband who had vanished, she would have been on the phone immediately, calling everyone she knew, alerting the authorities, doing everything possible to find him. But David had waited more than 24 hours, and that delay gnawed at her. Investigators shared her concerns. As they dug deeper into David Thompson's background, they found a man whose life seemed perfectly ordinary on the surface, but who revealed very little about his interior world. He had grown up in Jonesboro, the son of a factory worker and a woman who had passed away when David was 16. He had no criminal record, not even a traffic violation. He had been married once before Jennifer, briefly, when he was 19, but that marriage had ended in divorce after less than a year. The ex-wife, when investigators tracked her down, said David had been controlling and possessive, that he had wanted to know where she was at all times, that he had isolated her from her friends and family. She said she had left him because she felt suffocated, because she felt like she could not breathe in his presence. But she also said he had never been physically aggressive toward her, that he had never threatened her, that the problems had been psychological rather than physical. The timeline of David's movements on May 14th remained a central focus of the investigation. Detectives retraced his route from home to work and back again, timing the drive under various conditions. From the Thompson property to the John Deere dealership where David worked was 17 miles, a drive that took approximately 25 minutes on the rural highways. David said he had left home at 7:15 Thursday morning and arrived at work shortly before 8. His supervisor confirmed David had clocked in at 7:53. This timeline fit. David said he had been at work all day, and his coworkers confirmed this. The dealership's service bay had security cameras, and investigators reviewed the footage, watching David move in and out of frame as he worked on various pieces of equipment throughout the day. There were no gaps in the footage, no periods where David was unaccounted for. He took his lunch break at noon, sitting in the break room with 2 other mechanics, and returned to work at 12:30. He clocked out at 4:58 in the afternoon, and the security footage showed him walking to his truck in the parking lot at 5:02. From the dealership to the gas station where David said he stopped was 3 miles, a 5-minute drive. The receipt showed he had purchased fuel at 5:47. From the gas station to his home was 7 miles, approximately 10 minutes. This would put David arriving home at around 5:57, not 5:30 as he had originally stated. When confronted with this discrepancy, David said he must have been mistaken about the time, that he had not looked at the clock when he got home, that he was estimating based on when he usually arrived. He said the missing time could be explained by the fact that he had sat in his truck for a few minutes after filling up, checking his phone messages, and returning a call to a parts supplier about an order. Investigators requested David's phone records and found that he had indeed made a call at 5:52 that lasted 4 minutes. This would account for some of the missing time, but not all of it. There were still gaps, moments unaccounted for, and those gaps troubled the detectives working the case. They asked David to take them through his movements minute by minute, and he did, his voice calm and steady, but the timeline still did not quite add up. Those who have worked investigations understand that small inconsistencies are common, that people misremember times and conflate events, that memory is imperfect. But they also know that sometimes those inconsistencies are signs of something more significant, evidence that someone is constructing a narrative rather than recalling one. The physical evidence from the Thompson property was minimal. Crime scene technicians processed the house thoroughly, dusting for fingerprints, collecting fibers, looking for any sign of a struggle or foul play. They found nothing unusual. The house was clean, almost too clean, with no blood, no signs of violence, no indication that anything traumatic had occurred there. They tested the coffee mug beside the sink and confirmed it contained Jennifer's fingerprints and the residue of coffee. But this told them nothing they did not already know. They examined Jennifer's car and found it exactly as it should be, the interior clean, the gas tank nearly full, the keys hanging on the hook by the door where David said they always were. The barn behind the house received special attention. It was old and ramshackle, the kind of structure that had been patched and repaired so many times it seemed held together by rust and stubbornness. Inside, there were stacks of old equipment, bags of feed, tools hanging on nails driven into the wooden beams. The floor was dirt, packed hard from decades of use. Cadaver dogs were brought through the barn multiple times, and on one occasion, one of the dogs alerted near the back corner, where a pile of old tarps lay folded against the wall. Investigators carefully moved the tarps and began excavating the area beneath them, digging down through the packed earth, hoping and dreading what they might find. They dug for hours, going down 3 feet, but found nothing except old bottles and rusted cans, debris that had accumulated over years. Those who knew him said David Thompson remained eerily composed throughout the investigation. When detectives came to the house to ask more questions, he invited them in without hesitation, answered everything they asked, never requested an attorney or showed any sign of defensiveness. When they asked to search the property again, he agreed immediately. When they asked him to take a polygraph examination, he said he would do whatever would help find Jennifer. The polygraph was administered at the state police barracks in Jonesboro on May 23rd. The examiner, a veteran with 20 years of experience, asked David a series of questions about Jennifer's disappearance, about whether he had harmed her, about whether he knew where she was. David passed the polygraph. Or rather, the results were inconclusive, which in the language of polygraph examinations often means the same thing as passing. The examiner noted in his report that David's physiological responses were unusually flat across all questions, showing minimal variation between control questions and relevant questions. This could indicate truthfulness, or it could indicate someone who had trained themselves to control their responses, or it could indicate a person with an unusual psychological makeup that did not respond normally to stress. The examiner could not say for certain what it meant, only that the results could not definitively prove deception. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about David Thompson. Some believed he was involved in Jennifer's disappearance, that his calm demeanor and inconsistent timeline pointed to guilt. Others thought he was simply an unusual person, someone whose way of processing trauma did not match what people expected, but who was nevertheless innocent. The lack of physical evidence made it impossible to move forward with any charges. Without Jennifer's body, without witnesses, without proof of foul play, there was nothing to prosecute. The case remained active, but as summer turned to fall and fall turned to winter, the leads dried up and the investigation slowed to a crawl. Michael, the 4-year-old boy who had been alone in the house when his mother disappeared, was interviewed multiple times by child forensic specialists trained to speak with young witnesses. He sat in rooms designed to be comfortable and non-threatening, with toys and soft chairs, and kind-voiced specialists who asked him gentle questions about that Thursday in May. What did he remember about that day? What had his mother been doing? Had anyone come to the house? Had he heard anything unusual? Michael's answers were vague and uncertain, the responses of a child too young to understand what was being asked or why it mattered. He said his mother had been there, and then she had not. He said he had watched television. He said he could not remember anything else. But there was one thing Michael said that caught the attention of investigators. When asked if he had been scared when he was alone in the house, Michael said no, because his father had told him his mother would be gone for a while but she would come back. The specialist asked when his father had said this, and Michael said he did not remember, maybe before, maybe after. The statement was ambiguous, and when investigators asked David about it, he said he had told Michael after he got home Thursday evening that his mother had gone somewhere but would return soon, trying to comfort the boy and keep him from being frightened. It was a reasonable explanation, but it left investigators wondering if there was another interpretation, a darker reading of those words that suggested David had known Jennifer would be gone before he came home to find her missing. The investigation stretched into 1999, then into 2000, and still there were no answers. The file on Jennifer Thompson's disappearance grew thick with reports and interviews and dead-end leads. Her face remained on the posters around town, though weather and time faded the images until they were barely recognizable. Patricia Wells continued to call the sheriff's office regularly, asking if there was any news, any developments, any reason to hope. She was told each time that the case remained open, that investigators were following up on any new information that came in, but that there was nothing concrete to report. And David Thompson continued to live in the house where Jennifer had vanished, raising their 2 children alone, going to work each day, and coming home each night to rooms that echoed with absence. Part 3. The silence. By the spring of 2001, 3 years after Jennifer Thompson vanished, the case had settled into that particular kind of limbo reserved for unsolved disappearances. The active search had long since ended. The media had moved on to other stories. The reward fund remained unclaimed. David Thompson had become a single father in all but the legal sense, though Jennifer had never been declared deceased. He dropped Emma off at school each morning and picked her up each afternoon. He made lunches and helped with homework and attended parent-teacher conferences. Michael, now 7 years old, had started first grade and was in many ways a normal child, playing with other kids at recess and bringing home drawings he had made in art class. But those who knew the family said there was something different about the Thompson children, a quietness that seemed unnatural for kids their age, a wariness that showed itself in the way they watched adults, as if they were waiting for something terrible to happen again. David had put the house up for sale in the fall of 2000. It had not sold immediately, the property's isolation and the notoriety of Jennifer's disappearance making it difficult to find buyers. But eventually, a couple from out of state who did not know the history made an offer, and in January 2001, David moved with the children to a rental house in Jonesboro, closer to town and schools, and the normalcy he seemed to be seeking. The new house was smaller, a 2-bedroom place with worn carpet and thin walls, but it had the advantage of being anonymous, a place where neighbors did not know their story, where Emma and Michael could walk to school without passing the field where searchers had once called their mother's name. Patricia Wells saw her grandchildren regularly, though her relationship with David had become strained to the point of breaking. She told friends that she believed David knew what had happened to Jennifer, that she could see it in his eyes when he looked at her, a knowledge he carried but would not share. But she also knew that pushing too hard might result in David cutting off her access to Emma and Michael, and she could not bear the thought of losing them too. So she remained civil, visited when David allowed it, took the children for weekends when he agreed, and waited. She did not know what she was waiting for, only that someday, somehow, the truth would surface. It always did. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt that terrible uncertainty gnawing at you day after day, there is no peace in waiting. Patricia lived with that doubt every day, oscillating between believing David was guilty and wondering if she was being unfair to him, if grief and desperation were making her see malice where there was only tragedy. She had hired a private investigator briefly, using money she had saved for years, but the investigator had turned up nothing new. He had retraced the same ground the police had covered, interviewed the same people, and come to the same dead end. Jennifer was gone, and there was no trail to follow. David Thompson's life in those years after the move seemed outwardly stable, but inwardly fractured in ways that only became apparent in retrospect. He continued working at the dealership, his performance adequate if not exceptional. His coworkers described him as even more withdrawn than before, someone who came to work, did his job, and left without engaging in the casual conversations that filled the breaks between tasks. He never spoke about Jennifer. If someone new to the dealership asked about his wife, someone would quietly pull them aside later and explain that she had gone missing years ago, that it was better not to bring it up. David ate lunch alone, sitting in his truck in the parking lot with the radio playing low. At home, the children began to show signs of the strain they were under. Emma, now 10 years old, had become responsible beyond her years, taking care of Michael when David worked late, making sure he did his homework and brushed his teeth before bed. She was quiet at school, her teachers noting that she rarely spoke unless called on, that she seemed to carry a weight that children her age should not have to bear. A school counselor met with her several times, trying to draw her out, to get her to talk about her feelings. But Emma remained guarded, giving short answers and deflecting any questions about her home life or her missing mother. Michael, on the other hand, had begun having nightmares. He would wake in the middle of the night screaming, and David would have to go to his room and sit with him until he calmed down. When asked what the nightmares were about, Michael said he dreamed about his mother, that she was calling to him but he could not find her. Sometimes he said she was in the house but invisible, that he could hear her voice but when he looked, no one was there. A child psychologist, David, took him to said the nightmares were a normal response to unresolved trauma, that Michael was processing his mother's disappearance in the only way his young mind knew how. The psychologist recommended therapy, but David stopped bringing Michael after only a few sessions, saying it was too expensive and did not seem to be helping. There were small moments during those years that, when examined later, seemed to reveal something lurking beneath the surface of David's carefully maintained facade. Emma told her grandmother about a night when she had come downstairs to get a glass of water and found her father sitting in the dark living room, just sitting there in the silence with no television on, no lights, nothing, just sitting and staring at nothing. Patricia asked Emma if her father did this often, and Emma said sometimes, late at night when he thought the children were asleep. Patricia asked what he was thinking about, and Emma said she did not know, she was afraid to ask. Michael drew pictures at school, as children do, and some of those pictures found their way home in his backpack where Emma would discover them. One drawing showed a house with stick figures, a mother and father and 2 children, and beneath the ground beside the house, another figure colored in black with X's for eyes. The teacher had written on the back, "Please talk to Michael about this." David never did, or if he did, he never mentioned it to anyone. The drawing disappeared, and when Emma asked Michael about it later, he said he could not remember making it. In the fall of 2002, David began dating someone, a woman named Rebecca who worked at a grocery store in Jonesboro. The relationship was cautious and slow, both of them aware that David was still technically married, that Jennifer had never been declared deceased, that legally he was not free. But emotionally, practically, he had been alone for more than 4 years, and Rebecca represented a possibility of moving forward, of building something new from the wreckage of what had been. Patricia Wells learned about the relationship from Emma, who mentioned in passing that her father's friend Rebecca had come over for dinner. Patricia felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity.